The morning of June 19th, 1944, brought an oppressive heat to the waters west of the Mariana Islands. Commander Toshikazu Ohmae stood in the cramped intelligence section aboard the carrier Zuikaku, studying reconnaissance photographs with growing unease. The images, taken by a daring patrol plane that had somehow survived American combat air patrols, showed something that defied belief. Stretched across the horizon in perfect geometric formation were carrier after carrier after carrier, American flat tops as far as the lens could capture. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ohmae counted them twice. 15 distinct carrier silhouettes. His hands trembled slightly as he marked each one on the plotting board. The first mobile fleet, Japan's most powerful striking force assembled for Operation Ago, had sailed into battle with 9 carriers. The Americans, by his count, had brought almost double that number. And these were not the pre-war carriers Japan's pilots had faced at Coral Sea or Midway. These were new ships, fresh from American shipyards. Essex-class carriers, the intelligence reports called them. The Essex-class represented everything Japanese naval planners had feared and denied for 3 years. When the first Essex, CV Dziwięć, had been commissioned in December 1942, Japanese intelligence officers had treated it as an anomaly. One ship did not make a trend. But by January 1943, Yorktown CV Dziesięć joined the fleet. Then Lexington CV 16 in February, Bunker Hill in May. By the summer of 1943, American shipyards were delivering a new Essex-class carrier every 60 days. Commander Ohmae had been among the first Japanese naval officers to grasp what this meant. His pre-war posting as an assistant naval attaché in Washington had exposed him to American industrial capacity in ways his colleagues could not fully comprehend. He had toured automobile factories in Detroit, watched steel pour from blast furnaces in Pittsburgh, observed the organized chaos of American mass production. When war came, Ohmae had filed report after report warning that Japan faced not just a larger fleet, but a fundamentally different kind of industrial opponent. Those reports had been filed and forgotten. The victories of 1941 and early 1942 had created an intoxicating atmosphere where such warnings seemed defeatist. Japan's carrier pilots were the elite of naval aviation, veterans who had honed their skills in China and perfected their tactics in the opening campaigns of the Pacific War. Quality would triumph over quantity. Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, where superior training and tactics would overcome numerical disadvantages. The Americans might build more ships, but Japan would build better ones. By mid-1944, that comforting narrative had collided with mathematical reality. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would become the largest carrier engagement in history, pitting elements of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet against Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. The numbers told a story that Japanese doctrine had not prepared for. 15 American carriers against 9 Japanese. Over 900 American aircraft against approximately 450 Japanese. 7 American fast battleships against none committed by Japan to the carrier force. The Essex-class itself embodied American industrial philosophy in ways that unsettled Japanese observers. Each carrier displaced 27,500 tons standard. Each carried an air group of 90 to 100 aircraft. Each was powered by 4 Westinghouse turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, giving a top speed of 33 knots. These were not the largest carriers ever built, but they were large enough, fast enough, and above all, buildable in quantities Japan could never match. Construction of the Essex-class had begun even before Pearl Harbor, with the keel of CV Dziwięć laid down on April 28, 1941. The shipyard workers at Newport News Shipbuilding did not yet know they were racing toward war, but their work proceeded with American efficiency. Prefabricated sections, standardized components, and assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing transformed carrier construction from a craftsman's art into an industrial process. The results spoke for themselves. Essex required just 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japanese carriers averaged 30 to 36 months. This gap meant that even if Japan matched American production rates, which it could not, American carriers would reach the fleet a full year faster. Time was a resource, and America possessed more of it. What made this especially devastating from Japan's perspective was how recently their own carrier strength had seemed adequate. At the start of the Pacific War in December 1941, Japan operated 10 carriers with the finest naval aviators in the world. The first air fleet that struck Pearl Harbor represented the pinnacle of carrier warfare, a concentrated force that could project power across thousands of miles of ocean. Those 6 carriers and their pilots had seemed invincible. Midway in June 1942 shattered that invincibility. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom, along with their air groups. Japan could build new carriers eventually, but the pilots lost at Midway represented years of training that could not be quickly replaced. The Guadalcanal campaign that followed extracted even more irreplaceable losses. Every veteran pilot killed was a library of combat knowledge destroyed. Japan's training programs could produce new pilots, but not experienced ones. By contrast, American pilot training had become an industrial system as sophisticated as the shipyards building the carriers. Training facilities in Florida, California, and Texas processed thousands of aviation cadets through standardized curricula. Veterans rotated home to pass combat lessons to trainees. Carrier qualification training occurred on paddle-wheel steamers converted to training carriers, allowing hundreds of pilots to practice deck landings without tying up frontline carriers. The system produced pilots in numbers that Japan could not match, and to a standard that surprised Japanese commanders. The Essex carriers gave these pilots platforms that emphasized sustainability over individual performance. Japanese carriers like Taiho, commissioned in March 1944 as Japan's newest and theoretically most advanced carrier, embodied a different philosophy. Taiho featured an armored flight deck, the first on a Japanese carrier designed to survive bomb hits. She displaced 29,300 tons and could launch up to 75 aircraft. Her designers had prioritized protection and striking power in a single elite vessel. 3 months after commissioning, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she was struck by a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. Poor damage control and a design flaw in her ventilation system allowed aviation fuel vapors to accumulate throughout the ship. Hours after the initial hit, a massive explosion tore her apart. Taiho sank with over 1,600 men. Japan's most advanced carrier had lasted 3 months in service. The contrast with American carrier survivability would become increasingly stark as the war progressed. Essex-class carriers would survive kamikaze hits, bomb strikes, and torpedo attacks that would have doomed earlier designs. Redundant systems reflected American engineering, philosophy prioritizing repair and continuation of service over preventing damage. Better to build a ship that could absorb punishment and keep fighting than one that might survive a single hit but would be lost if that defense failed. Essex carried this philosophy into every aspect of design. The flight deck measured 862 feet by 108 feet, providing ample space for aircraft operations. 3 aircraft elevators moved planes between the hangar deck and flight deck with remarkable efficiency. The ship carried enough aviation fuel for sustained operations far from base, supported by the fleet train of tankers and supply ships that allowed American carriers to remain at sea for months. Japanese carriers, constrained by fuel shortages and limited tanker capacity, could barely reach the battle area, let alone sustain extended operations. By June 1944, 18 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned, with more under construction. The original program called for 24 ships. This exceeded Japan's total carrier construction for the entire war, including light carriers and conversions. The Americans had not just built more carriers, they had industrialized carrier warfare itself. Commander Ohmae understood that the photographs he studied represented more than a tactical problem. They documented a strategic catastrophe. Operation Ago had been planned as the decisive battle that would crush American carrier power and restore Japanese control of the Philippine Sea. The plan relied on land-based aircraft supplementing the carrier air groups, attacking American forces from multiple directions, while Japanese carriers launched strikes from beyond the range of American counterattacks. It was elegant in concept, depending on Japan's remaining advantages in aircraft range and the proximity of island air bases. Reality had not cooperated with planning. American carrier strikes in the days before the battle had devastated Japanese land-based air power in the Marianas. The promised hundreds of aircraft that would help overwhelm American defenses had been destroyed on the ground or shot down in desperate defensive battles. Now Ozawa's mobile fleet would face Task Force 58 without the land-based support that was supposed to make victory possible. The intelligence section's analysis of American carrier composition revealed another disturbing pattern. Task Force 58 included 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, organized into 4 task groups. Each task group functioned as a self-contained striking force, with 3 to 4 carriers plus supporting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans could split their carriers into independent formations or mass them for overwhelming strikes. Japanese doctrine had never seriously considered facing such numerical superiority. What haunted Ohmae most was not the count of carriers present, but the knowledge of what was being built. Intelligence intercepts and analysis of American industrial capacity suggested that the 15 carriers at Philippine Sea represented only part of America's growing carrier fleet. More Essex-class carriers were completing sea trials or fitting out at East Coast and West Coast shipyards. The pipeline of construction meant that even catastrophic American losses could be replaced within months. Japan had no similar pipeline. Japanese carrier construction in 1944 consisted of the Unryu class, simplified carriers based on the pre-war Hiryu design. The plan called for 16 Unryu class carriers to supplement the fleet. By June 1944, not one had been commissioned. The lead ship, Unryu herself, would finally commission in August, but lack of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots meant she would never conduct fleet operations. She would be sunk by an American submarine in December while attempting to transport kamikaze aircraft to the Philippines. The program that was supposed to rebuild Japan's carrier fleet had produced 3 commissioned ships by war's end. 3 carriers, compared to the 24 Essex-class ships American yards delivered. This 900% disparity exceeded even pessimistic pre-war assessments. Japanese naval planners had assumed a 2-to-1 or perhaps 3-to-1 American advantage. They had not imagined 8-to-1 odds, and those odds excluded the light carriers and escort carriers America was simultaneously producing. The industrial mathematics were merciless. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 60,000 tons of steel. American steel production in 1944 exceeded 90 million tons. Japan's steel production, hampered by resource shortages and bombing, had fallen to less than 5 million tons. Even if Japan devoted its entire steel output exclusively to carriers, which was impossible given competing demands for merchant ships, destroyers, and aircraft, it could not approach American production rates. Similar disparities plagued every aspect of carrier construction. Specialized equipment like catapults, arresting gear, and fire control systems required precision manufacturing and advanced metallurgy. America's pre-war industrial base included thousands of companies capable of producing such equipment to exacting specifications. Japan's industrial base, smaller and now under sustained attack, struggled to maintain output of existing systems, let alone expand production. The Americans had also solved the problem of carrier aircraft production. Each Essex carried 90 aircraft, meaning that 18 Essex-class carriers represented over 1,600 aircraft at sea. American aircraft factories produced tens of thousands of planes annually. Japan's entire aircraft industry struggled to produce that many fighters of all types in 1944, quality compounded quantity. The Hellcat represented the latest generation of American carrier fighters, with a top speed of 380 miles per hour 6 50-caliber machine guns, and robust construction that allowed it to absorb battle damage and continue fighting. Japanese Navy fighters like the Essex-class had been superior in 1941, but by 1944 they were outmatched in speed, firepower, and durability. Japan's attempts to field improved fighters, like the Eijideme Repu, encountered production delays and never reached operational status in significant numbers. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers showed similar advantages. The SBDVC Helldiver, though initially troublesome, had matured into an effective strike aircraft. The TBF Avenger provided reliable torpedo and bombing capabilities. Japanese equivalents, like the Ditteri Y Yudi and Psheshten Jil, performed adequately when flown by experienced pilots, but the pool of such pilots was nearly exhausted. American aircrew training produced pilots faster than combat consumed them. Japanese training could not keep pace with losses. The technological edge extended to electronics and radar. American carriers mounted increasingly sophisticated radar systems for air search, surface search, and fighter direction. These systems allowed American combat air patrols to intercept Japanese strikes at long range, vectoring fighters to precise interception points. Japanese radar technology lagged significantly. Carriers like Taiho mounted radar sets, but their performance and integration into tactical doctrine remained inferior to American systems. Perhaps most critically, American doctrine had evolved to maximize the Essex-class advantages. Task Force 58 operated as an integrated weapons system where carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers functioned in coordinated mutual defense. Radar-directed combat air patrols, dense anti-aircraft fire controlled by proximity-fused shells, and aggressive fighter tactics created layered defenses that Japanese strike aircraft could not penetrate. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would demonstrate this integration with devastating effectiveness. Commander Ohmae closed the reconnaissance photographs and drafted his assessment for Admiral Ozawa's staff. The numbers could not be softened. The Americans had brought overwhelming force. Japanese advantages in aircraft range and land-based support had evaporated. The coming battle would not be the decisive engagement doctrine promised. It would be a test of whether Japanese courage and tactical skill could overcome a threefold disadvantage in numbers and technology. He knew the answer already. The photographs told the story that Japanese pride refused to accept. America had not merely built more carriers. America had transformed carrier warfare into an industrial product, manufactured with the same systematic efficiency that produced automobiles and steel. The Essex-class represented not ships but a system. Design, production, crew training, aircraft manufacturing, logistics support, all coordinated into an engine of naval warfare that Japan could not match or defeat. The battle would begin in hours. Ohmae suspected it would be over quickly, though not in the way Operation Ago envisioned. He filed his report and returned to the plotting board, marking the positions of 15 American carriers that represented not just numerical superiority, but the triumph of industrial civilization over warrior tradition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first Japanese strike wave launched at 7:45 on the morning of June 19th. 169 aircraft lifted from the decks of Ozawa's carriers, circling to form up before heading east toward the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Yamaguchi led his fighter squadron from Zuikaku's deck, watching his pilots struggle to maintain formation. Most were recent graduates of accelerated training programs, with perhaps 50 hours of flight time since earning their wings. In 1941, Japanese carrier pilots had averaged over 800 hours before their first combat mission. Yamaguchi knew what awaited them. American radar would detect the strike at 80 to 100 miles, giving ample time to launch interceptors and position combat air patrols. His pilots would face F Hellcats flown by experienced aviators, backed by anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships equipped with proximity-fused shells. The mathematics were brutal. Most of his squadron would not return. They never reached the American carriers. 50 miles from Task Force 58, radar operators aboard the carriers detected the incoming raid. Admiral Mitcher's staff calculated vectors and launched every available fighter. Over 250 Hellcats climbed to intercept. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, flying from USS Lexington, spotted the Japanese formation first. The enemy aircraft flew in loose formation, lacking the tight discipline that had characterized pre-war Japanese air groups. He radioed his wingmen and dove to attack. The engagement lasted less than 8 minutes. Vraciu alone shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, exhausting his ammunition. Across the battle space, other Hellcat pilots reported similar successes. Japanese pilots, overwhelmed by the speed and firepower of the American fighters, broke formation and scattered. Some attempted to press through to the carriers. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed most of them. A few bombers reached attack positions and released their ordnance. Every bomb missed. Every torpedo ran wide or was evaded. The first wave lost 42 aircraft with no damage to American ships. The second wave, launched at 8:56, encountered the same fate. 98 additional Japanese aircraft flew into a wall of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The third wave of 47 aircraft achieved nothing. The fourth wave of 82 planes fared worst of all, intercepted far from the American fleet and cut to pieces by Hellcats that had rearmed and refueled. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. American pilots called it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The name captured the one-sided nature of the engagement. Japanese losses exceeded 300 carrier aircraft in a single day. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than enemy action. The kill ratio approached 11-1. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome such disparity in pilot quality, aircraft performance, and defensive technology. Commander Ohmae received the first damage reports in stunned silence. The numbers made no sense within the framework of Japanese naval doctrine. Operation Eigo had assumed that Japanese aircraft and pilots, operating at longer range with land-based support, would inflict devastating losses on American carriers before being destroyed themselves. The plan accepted heavy Japanese casualties in exchange for crippling American offensive power. Both fleets would be roughly equal after the battle, and Japan's strategic position would be preserved. Instead, the mobile fleet's striking power had been annihilated while inflicting no meaningful damage on the enemy. Task Force 58 had not lost a single carrier. American aircraft losses had been minimal. The decisive battle had occurred, but the decision went entirely against Japan. Ohmae understood what his superiors would struggle to accept. The battle was not lost due to tactical errors or bad luck. It was lost because Japan faced an opponent operating under entirely different rules. Worse news arrived as the scope of the disaster expanded. 2 American submarines, Albacore and Kavala, had penetrated the Japanese screening forces and torpedoed fleet carriers. Taiho, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet commissioned just 3 months earlier, exploded and sank from poor damage control following a single torpedo hit. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, took 3 torpedoes and went down. 2 fleet carriers lost, both to submarines, while the surface fleets never engaged. The symbolism was crushing. Japan's most advanced carrier, and one of its most experienced, had been destroyed not in glorious combat, but by unseen enemies attacking from below. Admiral Ozawa maintained radio silence, not fully comprehending the extent of his losses. His own carrier, Zuikaku, had survived relatively undamaged. From his perspective, the battle continued. American carriers might have repelled his strikes, but surely they had expended their fighters and ammunition doing so. Japanese doctrine emphasized persistence and fighting spirit. The war was not lost until the spirit was broken. Reality would not accommodate such optimism. As reconnaissance flights returned and damage reports compiled, the truth emerged. The mobile fleet had lost over 400 aircraft, 2 fleet carriers, and accomplished nothing. Task Force 58 remained fully operational, with overwhelming strength, There would be no night attack, no dawn strike, no redemption. The American carriers would remain beyond range, invulnerable, while Japanese carriers limped away with depleted air groups and shattered morale. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications rippled through Japanese naval command. The Eigo Plan had represented Japan's last realistic chance to inflict a decisive defeat on American carrier forces. Every available carrier had been committed. Land-based air support had been positioned. The battle had been fought in waters favorable to Japanese operations. Everything that doctrine promised had been attempted, and it had failed completely, not marginally but catastrophically. Captain Toshikazu Ohmae spent the following weeks analyzing why. His reports to Naval General Headquarters detailed not just the battle, but the systemic failures that made defeat inevitable. The problem was not courage, tactics, or even pilot training in isolation. The problem was industrial capacity translated into overwhelming material superiority. America was not fighting the same war. Japan was fighting. Japan sought decisive battles where quality triumphed over quantity. America fought an industrial war where quantity became quality. The Essex carriers exemplified this transformation. Consider the logistics. Each carrier required approximately 6,800 tons of fuel oil for operations. Task Force 58's 15 carriers, plus supporting ships, consumed hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel during the Philippine Sea operation. American fleet oilers provided that fuel from floating reserves that would have exhausted Japan's entire monthly allocation. The United States maintained a fleet train of tankers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that allowed continuous operations far from base. Japanese carriers, when they could obtain fuel at all, operated on margin with no reserve. Aircraft replacement showed similar disparities. American carriers maintained spare aircraft aboard and received regular replenishment from escort carriers serving as aircraft transports. A carrier that lost half its air group in combat could be restored to full strength within days by simply flying replacement aircraft aboard from the ferry carriers. Japanese carriers that lost aircraft had no ready replacements. New planes had to be built, tested, and then flown to the fleet by pilots who were themselves scarce. The process took weeks or months, assuming the carriers survived that long. Ammunition expenditure revealed the same pattern. American carriers fired thousands of 5-inch anti-aircraft shells during the battle, supplemented by 40mm and 20mm cannon fire that consumed ammunition by the ton. Every ship returned to Eniwetok or Ulithi after the battle and replenished completely within days. Japanese ships that expended ammunition faced weeks of waiting for resupply, if resupply was available at all. American ships could fight every day. Japanese ships had to husband resources. Even personnel replacement favored the Americans. Damaged American carriers sent their air groups to other carriers or shore bases while the ships underwent repair. The pilots remained in the fleet, maintaining their skills and experience. Japanese carriers that suffered damage often lost their entire air groups as pilots were reassigned to land-based units or killed in the fighting. The institutional knowledge that made air groups effective disappeared with each loss. America preserved experience. Japan bled it away. Ohmae's analysis identified the Essex-class as the weapon that had decisively shifted naval warfare from art to industry. Previous carrier battles had been contests between roughly equivalent forces where tactics and skill determined outcomes. Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz. All had been battles where single ships or small differences in timing could change results. Philippine Sea was different. The American advantage was so overwhelming that no plausible Japanese tactical innovation could have altered the outcome. Consider the numbers in detail. 18 Essex-class carriers, commissioned between December 1942 and June 1944, represented over 495,000 tons of carrier displacement. Japan's entire carrier force in June 1944, including light carriers and converted ships, totaled approximately 230,000 tons, America had built more than twice Japan's entire carrier fleet in just 18 months, and the building continued. Newport News, shipbuilding, where Essex was constructed, employed over 30,000 workers, organized in 3 shifts to maintain round-the-clock construction. The shipyard used prefabrication techniques, where major sections of the hull were built separately and then lifted into place by massive cranes. Welding replaced riveting for major construction, speeding assembly and reducing weight. Standardized components meant that equipment built for one carrier would fit any other Essex-class ship without modification. These techniques cut construction time by 40% compared to pre-war methods. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy shipyard, building Lexington CV-16 and other Essex carriers, employed similar mass production methods. The company's experience building merchant ships translated directly to carrier construction. Unlike Japanese shipyards, which relied on skilled craftsmen building each ship as a unique creation, American yards treated carriers as products to be manufactured efficiently. The difference showed in delivery times. Japanese carrier construction averaged 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. Essex-class carriers averaged 20 months, some completed in as little as 16 months. These construction times directly translated to force availability. An American carrier damaged in battle could be repaired and returned to service in 3 to 6 months. A Japanese carrier suffering equivalent damage might spend a year in dry dock if dry dock space and repair materials were available. During 1944, American shipyards simultaneously built new carriers, repaired battle-damaged carriers, and modified existing carriers with improved anti-aircraft batteries and radar. Japanese shipyards struggled to complete unfinished construction, while air raids disrupted production schedules. The pilot training disparity compounded material advantages. By mid-1944, the United States Navy operated a pilot training pipeline that produced over 1,000 carrier-qualified pilots per month. Training began with pre-flight school, progressed through primary flight training on basic aircraft, advanced to operational training on combat types, and culminated in carrier qualification aboard training carriers. The entire process took 18 to 24 months and produced aviators with 300 to 400 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Japan's pilot training, constrained by fuel shortages and aircraft availability, had collapsed to basic competency. New pilots received perhaps 50 to 100 hours of training, with minimal aerobatics, almost no gunnery practice, and often just a single carrier landing before assignment to fleet squadrons. These minimally trained pilots faced American veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The result was predictable massacre. At Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots flee straight and level into American guns because they lacked the skill to maneuver effectively while maintaining formation. The technology gap widened with each month of war. American research laboratories and production facilities introduced improved aircraft, radar systems, and weapons at a pace Japan could not match. The Fsheshtvef Hellcat that dominated Philippine Sea entered service in January 1943. By mid-1944, over 5,000 had been built. The Fshteryu Corsair, even more capable, was entering carrier service. Japan's aviation industry struggled to maintain production of existing designs, let alone develop improved models. Radar technology provided similar disparities. American carriers mounted multiple radar sets for air search, surface search, and fighter direction. These systems could detect aircraft at 80 to 100 miles and vector fighters to precise interceptions. The SM Fighter Direction Radar, introduced in 1944, allowed controllers to guide multiple fighter divisions simultaneously to different targets. Japanese carriers mounted basic air search radar with limited range and no fighter direction capability. Japanese pilots relied on visual sighting, giving Americans enormous advantages in beyond visual range interception. Anti-aircraft artillery showed the same pattern. Essex-class carriers mounted 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, capable of engaging both surface and air targets. These were supplemented by 32 to 48 40mm anti-aircraft guns in quad mounts, plus dozens of 20mm cannon. The 40mm Bofors guns, directed by radar and equipped with proximity-fused ammunition from 1943 onward, created a lethal defensive zone around the carriers. Japanese carriers mounted fewer, less effective anti-aircraft weapons with no proximity fuses and limited fire control systems. Commander Ohmae's most damning finding concerned not technology or numbers but strategic vision. American naval planning had, since the start of war, assumed a long attritional conflict where industrial capacity would prove decisive. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, passed before Pearl Harbor, had authorized massive carrier construction based on the assumption that America would need overwhelming force to prevail in a Pacific war. The Essex-class had been designed not for individual supremacy, but for mass production. Every aspect of the design prioritized buildability and operational sustainability over maximum performance. Japanese naval planning had assumed the opposite. The decisive battle doctrine, refined over decades, posited that superior Japanese ships and sailors would defeat numerically larger American forces in a climactic engagement that would shatter enemy morale and force a negotiated peace. Japanese carriers like Taiho incorporated the best technology Japan could produce in small numbers. The plan was to build excellent ships, crew them with superb aviators, and win through qualitative superiority. Industrial capacity was acknowledged, but deemed less important than warrior spirit and tactical excellence. Philippine Sea proved which assumption matched reality. American industrial capacity had overwhelmed Japanese qualitative advantages so completely that the battle became not a contest, but an execution. 15 Essex-class carriers, each individually capable, operating together as a coordinated force with overwhelming support, had crushed 9 Japanese carriers carrying Japan's remaining naval aviation expertise. The decisive battle had occurred. But the decision was not the outcome Japanese doctrine had promised. In the months following Philippine Sea, Japanese naval intelligence compiled a comprehensive assessment of American carrier construction. The numbers made grim reading. 24 Essex-class carriers would be built by war's end. 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, had already commissioned. Over 100 escort carriers, small and slow but useful for anti-submarine warfare and transport, supplemented the fleet. America's total carrier force in the Pacific, by mid-1945, would exceed 100 ships. Japan's carrier force by war's end consisted of 4 operational carriers, all survivors from the beginning of war, all obsolete, all without adequate air groups or fuel. The Unryu-class construction program that was supposed to rebuild Japanese carrier strength had produced 3 commissioned ships, none of which conducted fleet operations. Unryu herself was sunk by submarine in December 1944. Amagi capsized during an air raid in July 1945. Only Katsuragi survived the war, camouflaged and hidden never, having sailed with a full air group. The strategic implications were absolute. Japan had lost the carrier war not in any single battle, but through systematic industrial defeat. Every Japanese carrier lost was irreplaceable. Every American carrier lost was inconvenient. The Pacific War had become a war of attrition, and attrition wars are won by the side that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. America could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them, even if Japan had possessed the capability to sink them at all, which by mid-1944 it did not. Captain Ohmae's final report, submitted to Naval General Headquarters in August 1944, concluded with recommendations that were never implemented because they were impossible to implement. Japan needed to abandon offensive operations entirely and husband remaining forces for coastal defense. Remaining carriers should be converted to aircraft transports or scrapped for their steel. Pilots should be transferred to land-based units. Resources should focus on building small, cheap weapons for suicide attacks rather than expensive conventional forces that could not defeat American industrial superiority. The recommendations were rejected as defeatist. Fighting spirit would compensate for material disadvantage. New tactics would achieve what conventional methods could not. The war would continue, but private conversations among senior officers acknowledged what official documents would not. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had demonstrated conclusively that Japan faced not just a more powerful enemy, but a different kind of enemy. America waged industrial war with the systematic efficiency of a factory, producing weapons and warriors in quantities that made defeat inevitable. The Essex-class became, in Japanese military analysis, a symbol of this new reality. These carriers were not individually superior to Japanese carriers. Ship for ship, some Japanese carriers matched or exceeded Essex capabilities in specific areas. Taiho's armoured flight deck, for example, was theoretically more survivable than Essex's unarmoured deck. Japanese aircraft had longer range. Japanese torpedoes were more powerful. It was fought by fleets supported by industrial economies, sustained by logistics networks, and renewed by production capacity. The Essex-class excelled at everything that mattered for sustained industrial warfare. They could be built quickly. They could be repaired easily. They could operate for extended periods far from base. They could absorb battle damage and continue fighting. They were, in short, war-winning weapons, not because they were the best carriers ever built, but because they were the best carriers that could be built in decisive numbers. The human cost of this industrial disparity fell heavily on Japanese carrier aircrews. Pilots who survived Philippine Sea found themselves assigned to bases with inadequate aircraft, insufficient fuel, and no prospect of meaningful training. They flew obsolete planes against overwhelming enemy forces, knowing each sortie would likely be their last. The warrior culture that had sustained Japanese naval aviation through the early war years could not compensate for material reality. Courage could not defeat radar. Spirit could not overcome numbers. Training could not match experience. By October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese carrier aviation existed in name only. Admiral Ozawa commanded 4 carriers north of Leyte, serving as decoys to lure American carriers away from the invasion fleet. The Japanese carriers carried just 116 aircraft total, many flown by pilots with minimal training. This force of 4 carriers and 100 aircraft faced Task Force 38's 17 carriers, over 1,000 aircraft. The Japanese carriers succeeded as decoys, drawing Admiral Halsey's forces north. All 4 were sunk. Their sacrifice allowed Japanese battleships to nearly reach the invasion fleet, but persistent American air attacks drove the battleships away. Carrier aviation, which had begun the war as Japan's decisive weapon, ended as bait. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.